In this 5-part series from What's Going On with Shipping, we look at the 75-year history of the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command. And in Episode 3, we look at special missions. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So we've been looking at the 75-year history of the Military Sealift Command, created on October 1st, 1949. In our first episode, we looked at the formation of the Military Sea Transportation Service. Episode 2, we looked at the Korea and Vietnam War. Today, we're going to look at missions other than war that became really one of the main bedrocks for the Military Sea Transportation Service, later on Military Sealift Command. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. MSTS was created in 1949 by amalgamating the Navy Transportation Service, the Army Transport Service, and the Tanker and Petroleum Branch. It really had 3 types of ships: troop ships, freighters, and tankers. But the modern Military Sealift Command is much different. You see that dry cargo and tankers make up only a very small portion of the fleet. The bulk of the fleet is made up of ships that are doing either direct support for the U.S. Navy, the Combat Logistics Force, or the fleet support elements that provide support or pre-positioning and sea basing that will store equipment forward deployed for the Department of Defense. However, one of the key areas is the creation of the Special Missions category. Today, the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command contains a plethora of vessels that serve a variety of special missions. Some of them are founded back early in the history of Military Sea Transportation Service, with sonar surveillance vessels, range instrumentation vessels, and a host of other special mission craft. MSC began the process of designing unique ships to fill roles that only Military Sealift Command needed to have. So, for example, a lesson coming out of the Korean War was the necessity to move vehicles very quickly into a combat area and back out again. The traditional load-on, load-off vessel using the ship's cargo booms and cranes took a long time to offload. The idea was to create a ship that can go into a port, offload or load quickly, and therefore spend more time at sea, vice in port. And that matured into the 1958 vessel, the USNS Comet. Really the very first roll-on, roll-off ship that was purpose-built for ocean going. Now, the U.S. Maritime Administration maintains a database on board the USNS Comet, including a photo virtual 360 tour of the vessel that provides you an insight into this very unique vessel. In many ways, the modern roll-on, roll-off ship that makes up the heart of the Ready Reserve Force today had its inception in this. The design was matured so that in 1967, the gas turbine ship Admiral W.M. Callaghan came into being. This ship was unique and it featured the very first 2 LM2500 gas turbines. These are the same gas turbines that the U.S. Navy use. Turbine number 1 and 2 is located on board the Callaghan, which was built in 1967 and was named for the first commander of Military Sealift Command. And you can see the evolution of Callaghan from Comet, just a brief span, just over 10 years, but you'll see how fast that vessel has transformed. Again, this is available in a 360 virtual tour. The Arctic was an area very familiar to the ships and crews of the U.S. Merchant Marine, having braved the Murmansk Run during World War II. After World War II, the United States military began the process of establishing bases in and around the Arctic. Operation Sunak, the support of North Atlantic construction, was undertaken by MSTS as ships ventured up into the Labrador Sea, the Davis Strait, and Baffin Bay to construct outposts. Operation Blue Jay, the construction of the U.S. Air Force Base at Thule for the B-36 nuclear-capable strategic bomber, the Peacemaker, were all undertaken. Rear Admiral L.J. Huffman oversaw the deployment of 37 ships to establish the base at Thule, and it was not without danger. The USNS Sapa Creek, a tanker, ran into an iceberg and suffered severe damage. USNS Waukesha, one of the very small T1 tankers, operated by Marine Transport Line, traveling in ballast, found itself stuck on a reef in Upper Frobisher Bay, completely out of the water. But the biggest operation became the operation to support the DEW Line. This was the Distant Early Warning Line, established on the north shore of Canada and Alaska, a massive undertaking by the U.S. Military Sea Transportation Service. Multiple fleets were dispatched into this area for seasons to establish the DEW Line, these radar outposts that were meant to monitor against potential Soviet attack. Military Sea Transportation Service purpose-built a fleet of vessels, including 3 cargo ships, the Mirfak, the Miser, and the Elleton, 2 tankers, the Alata and the Chattahoochee, and then 1 large ocean-going cargo ship dock, the Point Barrow, along with converting other vessels to the process to transport all the equipment necessary for the DEW Line. Operation in the Arctic proved dangerous as ships suffered damage from the ice, but because of these actions, the commander of the Military Sea Transportation Service, Vice Admiral John M. Will be the only commander of MSTS to be promoted to 4-star rank for the operations in support of the creation of the DEW Line. Besides operations in the ice, both to the Arctic and Antarctic, the yearly resupply of McMurdo Station has become a facet of the Military Sealift Command, with a tanker and a cargo ship doing the annual run to the southern continent every year. The U.S. Military Sealift Command also operates a fleet of survey vessels, what are known as Tagos Boats, T-AGSs. The original survey boats were meant to go out into waters beyond the coast of the United States. That is a purview of NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration fleet. The U.S. Navy would go out and survey anchorages and waters outside of U.S. to ensure that ships could operate. However, several Tagos vessels were involved in very unique operations. 3 such Tagos vessels were the USNS Bowditch, Dutton, and Michelson, converted Victory ships. Now, these ships performed very unique missions. They were based in ports in Rota, Spain, Holy Loch, Scotland, and out in Guam in the Pacific. And these ships proved to be the vanguard for the deployment of the U.S. ballistic missile submarine fleet, the Polaris fleet. These ships went out and ran track lines, the track lines that the boomers would eventually run. Deep in the ship's hold was what's known as a SINS, a shipboard inertial navigation system. SINS allows a ship to keep track of where it is in the world without any external data. Remember, this is a period of time before satellite navigation. And ballistic missile submarines couldn't come up to periscope depth at sunrise and sunset to take a fix all the time. They would have to be underwater for prolonged periods of time, potentially under the Arctic ice. So they needed a system that calibrated for ocean current, for salinity, for gravity fluctuations, and the SIN systems on board Dutton, Michelson, and Bowditch were used to calibrate the units that went on board the boomers. They performed a very unique mission. And then there were ships known as TAGMs, Range Instrumentation Missile Vessels, or TAGMs, T-AGM, had been a facet of the Military Sea Transportation Service. Many of these ships were transferred over from, believe it or not, the U.S. Air Force. Yes, the U.S. Air Force operated a fleet of vessels. The Air Force contracted out with Pan America, to operate these vessels. But on the east coast of the United States, missile range instrumentation ships were operated by the U.S. Navy via MSTS. On the Pacific, they were operated by the U.S. Air Force. The decision was made to put them all under one banner, and what drove this was the manned space program. As the Mercury, eventually the Gemini, and then into the Apollo missions took place, there was a need to provide telemetry and uplink to the vessels, and these proved to be absolutely vital for communication for the mission. So, for example, when Apollo 8 with Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott found themselves in trouble, it was one of these TAGMs that was able to get the telemetry up to the capsule to allow them to do an emergency landing out in the Pacific when their rocket ship began to tumble out of control. And throughout the history of the space program, TAGMs provided essential service. Now, these were also used to monitor foreign rocket and missile ships. So, for example, ships like the USNS General H.H. Arnold and General Hoyt S. Vandenberg were used to monitor missile launches from the Soviet Union and other nations to get telemetry from them. And today, one vessel remains in the TAGM fleet to monitor shipping and missile launches, along with a platform, the USNS SBX-1. Several other missions evolved over the history of the organization. One of them came out in the 1980s. This is at the height of the Cold War, when the United States was concerned about the Soviet Navy potentially flooding out into the Atlantic and the Pacific and cutting off the lifeline of supplies. And they were going to do that via their nuclear submarines. And the Hunt for Red October and all that type of literature that came out during that period really highlighted that. Now, the U.S. developed a system of underwater sonar surveillance, what was known as SOSUS. And the SOSUS arrays, which were hooked up via cable ships, and there were many cable ships operated by MSTS and MSC over the course of its history. One vessel still remains, USNS Zeus. But they linked together those SOSUS arrays. But the fear was the SOSUS arrays could be taken out, or there were areas where there wasn't enough coverage. And so the Military Sealift Command developed a series of mobile sonar surveillance vessels, what became known as SIRTAS. What exists today are really the end result of that program of the 1980s and 1990s. These are known as the Tagos Boats, T-AGOS. These are the ocean surveillance vessels. They use this surveillance towed array sensor system, the SIRTAS system, and the ships are built on a very unique design, what's called a swath design, this kind of catamaran design, this small waterplane area twin hull. They were originally a class of monohull, single-hull vessels, but sending them up into the North Atlantic in winter was not a great idea. The ships got pounded a lot, and while it was really rough for the crews, it was terrible for the SIRTAS array. The array is a long array that is towed behind the vessel. The initial arrays were passive. They were basically just listened. And so you had this long tube of sensors and basically hearing platforms that would be towed behind the vessel. You needed a nice stable one. The ships were propelled by this very unique diesel electric system that was extremely quiet. The SWAT system allowed the ships to ride much more stable, and then they had a modem uplink. I remember reading in the 80s about this modem that today is very comical in terms of the amount of bits it sent, something like a 40K modem, just a ridiculous amount. But these SIRTAS vessels have now been deployed into the Pacific. They're used to help monitor Chinese submarines, and they become also victims of attacks by the Chinese militia. There is a new class being built to replace the older versions. There are 5 of these that are out there: the Victorious class, and then Impeccable, which is a one-of-a-kind ship. The new class, they're talking about 7 new Tagos boats being built to replace them. And then one of the most unusual missions given to the Military Sealift Command is that of escort vessels for the U.S. Navy's ballistic missile submarines. So the U.S. Navy has ballistic missile submarines. These are the nuclear submarines that carry the Trident missiles, based in 2 places, one up in Bremerton, Washington, and the second in Kings Bay, Georgia. And normally these vessels are escorted out to sea by small Coast Guard cutters. However, there is a fear that larger vessels may get close to these boomers while they're transitioning from their berth out into the deep ocean. So the Military Sealift Command initially chartered and then procured 4 large offshore supply vessels, and they have turned them into escort vessels. And what you see is these offshore support vessels have been modified. For example, they carry these containers on the stern. This creates literally a wall and a barrier so that the ship can be put between the boomer and any potential attack. And up on the bow, you can see right here, you can't see it on the stern, are 2 25mm chain guns. They actually bring on board detachments, and so that they can fire into any vessel that gets close to the nuclear ballistic missile submarine. And 4 of them that are out there, they have very unoriginal names. They have the original names given to them by HOS. I really think that Military Sealift Command is missing an opportunity to rename these vessels, maybe for past commanders or merchant mariners who have done something. I think this is a great opportunity to really commemorate some people. But ships like the Black Powder, for example, along with its sister ship, would go out and escort boomers to and from their berth, 2 on each coast. They're both used at the same time to bring the boomers out. A very unique mission, and absolutely one that doesn't get talked about enough, but provides a vital aid for the ballistic missile. And over the course of the history of Military Sealift Command, we've seen this. We actually had modified Victory ships, for example, that carried an entire array of Polaris, later on Poseidon missiles. They would carry them out to Holy Loch in Scotland and out to Guam to replenish the nuclear missiles on board the ballistic missile submarines. They have to be periodically changed out. The missiles have to be cycled. And so you literally got these Victory ships that were out there, the Marshfield and a few others, that had an entire hold that possessed nuclear ballistic missile submarines. The rumor was that when those ships sailed with their 16 ballistic missiles on board, they were always followed by a U.S. Navy attack submarine. So the role of Military Sealift Command and its precursor in special missions is really unique. I mean, I could do hours talking about this. There's a lot of little submissions that go into this. So, for example, the USNS Mission Capistrano, which was a huge T2 tanker, was modified so that it could lower a massive sonar dome from its forward hulls into the water in and around the Bahamas to test submarines for detection. There's a variety of vessels. The Mizar, one of those ice freighters that would go up to the Arctic, was modified with a moon pool so it could launch ROVs and autonomous vehicles and personnel out of them to do underwater surveillance and diving. Just an array of technologies that came in that were being used by the Military Sealift Command. When you look at the over 600 ships that have had the designation USNS, United States Naval Ship, a lot of the special mission ships are really unique. Today, some of those missions have been abrogated to other areas. So, for example, the research vessels, the Tagors, have been contracted out to a lot of universities and survey institutions like Woods Hole Institute, for example. They operate survey vessels. But the survey ships of the Bowditch class, the Tags, for example, are still out there surveying harbors and doing research for ships of the U.S. Navy so they can go in. Missile range instrumentation ships like the Howard O. Lorzren is out there still tracking missiles out there along with SBX-1. And we're seeing ships like the Black Powder out there escorting nuclear submarines in and out of port. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit that super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Stay tuned for episode 4, where we look at the evolving of Military Sealift Command into the catch-all Navy Auxiliary Force for the U.S. Navy with the establishment of the Navy Fleet Auxiliary Force. This is the ships that conduct the underway replenishment for the entire U.S. Navy. Until our next episode, Sal, signing off.